In today's video, we're going to look at some simple ways that you can hack your brain to make you better at drawing. So I'm guessing if I gave you a pen like this one, you could write quite accurately and form letters in your native language. It's often said that the issue with drawing is not manual dexterity, it's about seeing, and this is very true. So what we need to do is see more accurately, and we need to interpret more accurately what we're seeing in order to send a signal to our hand to portray what we want to draw accurately. This is difficult because our brains get so much information that they often take shortcuts. So in this video, we're going to look at some ways to sort of hack your brain, and I'm going to give you some examples of ways that your brain might be tricking you a little bit into seeing or drawing things in the wrong way. There's going to be some mindset stuff at the end as well, but it's not all mindset. There's some very practical skills that I'm going to teach you in this video, so let's get started. So just briefly before we start the first point, I have new glasses. What do you think? They're actually green, although that may not show up on camera. And I chose them this time with contact lenses in, so I could actually see what I was choosing and not let the staff choose for me. Compliments or insults to be left in the comments. So what's the first thing that we want to think about? It's that we focus too much on the positive rather than the negative of a shape. We have all this information coming in, and so it's hard enough to think about what shape something is, but actually there are two parts to a shape when drawing. There's the positive, the shape itself, and there's the negative. Understanding the negative can really improve our drawing, so let's look at this first. So how do we use negatives of shapes effectively? So let's look at this subject here. Now I can draw these objects, I can draw the leaves, and I can draw these rose hips, and I can draw the stems. And I might look at the drawing and think, well, everything looks okay. What I really need to do then is check the negative spaces, because if the drawing is correct, then these spaces inside will also be correct. It doesn't matter if I'm working larger or smaller, the shape of them won't change. So I want you, when you're drawing, to really consider not only the object or objects themselves, but also the space around them, and if those negative spaces look the same. Now, if you'd like a full drawing and painting tutorial of this particular one, I believe it's in my autumn challenge playlist. Just pop it into the YouTube search bar and you'll find it. Now, the next way that our brain can trick us is that it mostly ignores foreshortening. If you've travelled like I have to Egypt, one of my favourite places, you'll have seen the paintings the Egyptians made, the ancient paintings, and of course all around the world there are things like cave paintings, and they're all done from this sort of flat side-on perspective. Now, although when we look at something that's turned at a certain perspective, we still understand what it is, nevertheless, our brain has a very simplistic idea of how it looks, and this can interfere with accurately portraying something that is at an angle, at a perspective. So let me show you how to deal with this. So if I ask you to draw these scissors, you're going to draw them in this kind of position from side on, because that's how your brain thinks about scissors. So you might draw them open like this, but if I turn them and ask you to draw them from this angle, you're going to struggle, you're going to find it difficult. So what you need to do is to force your eyes and your brain to check the proportions. So let me show you something that's at perspective. So I've got a car here, and the first thing you want to check is really height versus width. So we can check by sort of just taking a simple proportional measurement like that. We can think, well, there's the tallest part of the car, and you know, how wide is it? Maybe it's a little less than 2 times wider than it is deep. We can also check certain areas. I could take a straight line up here, for example, and think to myself, well, how much of this area is taken up by the wheel? Is it half or a third? It's about half. And by doing this, you're going to force your brain to make the proper marks on the paper. I've lots more in-depth videos that will show you exactly how to do this process. But the main thing is that you shouldn't trust your brain with perspective. You have to check. Now, you can physically measure with a ruler. You can do a simple comparison measurement like the one I've been showing you here. Or if you're actually physically looking at something you're drawing from life, you can do the measurement where you slide your thumb up and down. I've got other videos that will show you how to do that, to check how the proportions of one thing are in relation to another. You'll need to have your arm straight for that. As I said, I do demonstrate that in other drawing videos. But your mind is not easily set up to process perspective, even though you still understand that you're looking at scissors, that you're looking at a car, you'll struggle to get those exact proportions without making yourself do some measurements. Now, here's something you may not have thought of. It's actually easier to draw something that's unfamiliar to us. And that's because we don't have these sort of pre-existing ideas, these assumptions of what this object looks like. And this goes particularly for portraits. I'm going to show you a simple trick that will enable you to see what someone looks like a little bit better, especially if this is somebody that you know or a famous person, when you have all of these ideas of how they look. And that may not actually be what you're seeing. So here's a lovely copyright-free photograph. I've actually painted and drawn this lady separately. So I've done a drawing, I've also done a painting. But if I knew her personally, I might have very deep preconceptions about who she was. I might think that her ears were small, that her eyes were large, that she had long flowing hair. But of course, you can't see much of her hair here. And this is the difficulty. It comes down to perspective and to angles and to lighting. Somebody might have large eyes, but what if in the photograph they're actually squinting quite a lot and so the eyes appear smaller or they're turned away from you? So having too much of a deep understanding of the subject you're looking at can actually make your brain want to take shortcuts. And our brain wants to take shortcuts all the time with visual imagery because there's too much of it for us to process. And the brain really is just interested in keeping us safe. And so it will take these shortcuts. So one method that you can use when doing something that's very familiar to you, like a person you know, is to turn the picture upside down. Now, what this does is it slightly scrambles our brain and it makes things much less recognizable. So the shapes appear very strange. We're not used to seeing a mouth upside down. We're used to seeing it the right way up. And this will enable you to concentrate much more accurately on actual shapes and not the idea of the person. It doesn't just go for people. You can use this method for pretty much anything. Whilst we're on the subject of portraits, let's look at the biggest mistake people make when starting to draw portraits, and that's drawing the eyes in the head too high up. You'll see children do this. They sort of draw an oval and the eyes are at the top. And this is just human nature because we're so used to communicating with other people through our eyes. I'm looking now at the camera lens. If I were looking over here, it wouldn't be as easy for you to connect with me. Now, the eyes are actually halfway down the head, at least when somebody's head is held upright. There are exceptions to this rule, of course, so I'm going to tell you about those in a minute. But first of all, let's look at a simple way of spacing out where the eyes are in the head. When I say halfway down, I mean halfway between the center of the head and the top of the head. I'm not talking about here where my hair starts or up here where my hair is, way above my skull, or perhaps I might have a hat on. I'm talking about the physical halfway mark between the top and the bottom of my skull. Let me show you a simple trick for getting this right, and then I'm going to pop back and tell you about when this changes a little bit. So I'm going to sketch in pen here just because it's easier for you to see on camera. So if you look at a child's drawing, you'll see that what they do, we'll make an oval for the face here, what they do is they put the eyes right up here. If you've got children or grandchildren, go and have a look now, because what their brain is telling them is that your whole face is your features, because how often do we consider somebody's forehead? Foreheads are very boring and uninteresting, and we don't need to think about foreheads at all. Now, here's an easier way of getting your proportions roughly right. Once you've drawn the outside shape of your head, and you're going to ignore things like hair first of all, and hats and earrings, we'll put those on later. And you're going to say to yourself, well, the eyes are about halfway down, and then between the line of the eyes and the chin, the nose is about halfway down. Of course, this varies from person to person. And between the nose and the chin, the mouth is again about halfway. So then what we have is we have eyes, we have nose, and we have mouth. And then once we've got these proportions correct, we can add anything we want to, like hair and ears and neck. So starting with this rough guideline and adjusting to what you're seeing will give you a much better way of drawing a face. So that's just a basic rule, and this does change. So I'm not looking at the lens now, so I'm going to look forwards, and so I can see myself. And if you look at my eyes sort of halfway up here, if I tip my head back, then my eyes are going to move higher up in that oval. And if I tip my head down, My eyes, in fact, all of my features are going to squash down to the bottom. So I've got a couple of videos all about how to draw heads. They're quite old videos, and how to place features and how to deal with heads that turn on the side and things like that. They're quite old videos, but they still work very well. I'll link those in the description of this video. Now, as I spoke about at the beginning of this video, we're actually quite good at manual dexterity at manipulating a pencil. But the one thing that we do wrong is we always start with detail. So again, if you look at a child or an adult who is completely new to drawing, you ask them to draw, say you ask them to draw a cat's face, they'll always start with something like an eye and they sort of work out from there. This is terrible for our brains because we have absolutely no sort of guidelines. We have no way of telling how big or small something's going to be, and we might draw a very beautiful cat eye, but then we mess up the rest of the drawing because everything's out of proportion. We haven't got any guidelines, any anchor. Let me show you a better way of approaching this. So this one's an easy one. Instead of giving in to the temptation to start drawing this lovely panda face, I need first of all to plot where he fits, his outside shape, how much of his body is taken up by his head, some of the things around him. I also need to consider the negative spaces in terms of my paper. Perhaps my paper is a different shape to the photograph. How am I going to fit that in? I'm going to make rough, sketchy outlines for the shape of the panda, roughly where his head goes, where the bushes go, any other surrounding elements. I'm going to make sure that he's placed nicely on my paper before I ever go near his cute little face. Now, it's often said that objects don't have outlines in real life. Well, that's sometimes true and sometimes not. If you look at the paintings of Van Gogh, you'll see that he actually outlined quite a lot of things quite effectively. So I'm not 100% on this rule, but there are some things that really don't have any outlining, and that would be soft things, things with an edge that you can't really see. I'm talking about things like clouds and water reflections and sometimes shadows. Now, a very strange thing happens to our brain if we outline one of these objects. It makes them look like more solid objects. So rather than looking at a reflection, you'll think that you're actually looking at a thing that's in the water. Let's have a quick look at how to get this right. So let's imagine I have a riverbank and I have a tree standing above the river. Here's the tree trunk and perhaps some branches coming off like this. Now, when I go to draw the reflection, if I do exactly the same thing and I draw that edge and I draw that tree, it's going to look exactly like I've got two trees. It might look like a mirror image, but it's not going to give that impression of water. So there's several ways that you can depict this when you're drawing with a pencil, which is not, of course, exactly the same as, you know, a photographic image, and we've got more outlines going on. Maybe we've got some shading as well. A couple of ways that you can do this is that you can keep the areas down below much more broken. I could use, for example, a broken line like this, or I could use more sketchy shapes. I might also want to think about whether there's some interference with the water itself, breaking up the line or the edge of that image. The same goes for background clouds. I don't want to draw a cloud with a really hard edge. It's going to look very strange. It's going to look like it's a shape cut out of plastic. Instead, I can consider perhaps if it's a white cloud, I can just shade around it in order to get the image that I want. Just remember that when you outline something, it's going to make it look a lot more solid, and the softer and more broken you keep it, the more ethereal and soft it's going to look. We're about halfway through this video. As always, can I ask you very quickly to click that like button? Do free subscribe to the channel. I have dozens of drawing videos on this channel that are going to help you with your progress. If you can share with a friend or leave me a comment, that helps too, and I can teach more people on YouTube how to draw. Let's talk now about the difficulties of drawing under different circumstances. So I was once faced with having to draw a large mural on my daughter's wall, and I found it really difficult actually. Things that I would easily be able to draw if I was on a small piece of paper suddenly looked almost impossible when faced with an upright surface that was much larger than I was used to. Now, you can get used to drawing on a flat surface and you can get used to drawing on an upright surface. Neither is wrong. It's just what you're used to. So if you've gone to a lot of life drawing classes, you've done some acrylic painting, you may be completely used to working on an easel, and it may seem to you to be, the best way of viewing a subject, and certainly scientifically it could be thought of. But for me, I've always drawn flat. I drew on a flat surface as a child. As I got older, I started working in mediums where you have to work flat. So I'm talking about mosaics, printmaking, watercolors. I've always drawn on a flat surface. It's not at all difficult to me to draw on a flat surface. In fact, I struggle to use an easel. So there's no right or wrong here, but you can be faced with circumstances that are a bit out of your comfort zone, and you can find that what would have been easy to draw is now very difficult. So let me show you a couple of strategies that you can use to deal with this. Now, there are several things that we can do to make drawing in unfamiliar situations easier, to transfer an image onto an upright or flat surface, or to make it much larger or smaller. Now, I have longer videos on all of these techniques, so I'm going to refer you to those, but I'll go through some of them quickly. The first thing you can use is a grid, so you can overlay a grid of squares and transfer across into your squares. This one has the advantage that we can easily make something larger or smaller. This is what I did with my wall mural. I drew squares and I sized up. We can use a simplified grid. I've got a good method that uses cross diagonals. Again, I'll leave the link to that in the description of this video. Another thing we can do is to check angles. So just like the negative space between an object, the angles don't change either. So if we look at this here and we try to draw that stem and these other stems coming out, drawing very quickly and very roughly here, of course. What we can do then is that we can use angles to check if things are in the right place. So for example, if we look at this little nodule here on the stem and I take an angle here, this angle will not change no matter if I draw this tiny or if I draw it 3 foot high on a wall. So we can take this angle, I'll hold it as close as possible to my work, keeping it upright, and then we can bring this angle down and I can see if what I'm doing is right, and I think this needs to be a little bit smaller in order to get the angle the same. Something else we can do is to use the envelope technique. So looking just at these 3 berries here, we can say to ourselves, what sort of shape would a box be, or a multi-sided shape be, if I drew around it? This is something I use often for flower painting. We can draw that outside envelope shape of the thing that we're trying to depict, and then we can fit our subject in to that box. If you're working on something very large and complicated, and you're scaling up or down to a large extent, I would recommend one of the grid methods. For smaller things, particularly things at severe perspective, figures, cars, things like that, then the envelope technique is a good one. And for any subject at all, if you line up with your paper, you can check the angles between your objects. Have you ever drawn something and found that very strangely it looks like it's tipping up towards you? Now, there's a very specific reason why this happens. So I've got the lid of a pot here. Now, if I was drawing it, it could be at all sorts of angles, but if it was completely circular, the only way I would see it as a complete circle is either if it is tipped upright towards me or if I was above it looking down. So let me explain what you can do with something in your drawing if it looks like it's tipping up towards you and it shouldn't be. So let me show you how this tipping up effect works. I'm going to just from memory draw a mug or a cup on my paper here. And I see this most often with still life objects, things that are box or tube shaped, but also with things like rivers and pathways. So let's draw the base of my mug here. Handle's a bit small, isn't it? Let's not worry about that because that's not the bit I'm concentrating on. Let's draw the top ellipse. Now, if I draw this too deep, in other words, from here to here, too deep, it's going to look like it's tipping up towards us. So if you ever have something that's tipping up, all you need to do is reduce either the angle if it's straight-sided or the depth if it's an ellipse, and you'll see that it instantly lays flatter. Now, I have a video all about how to draw ellipses and to get them right, because this is an area that people also get very wrong. People often paint a bottom of a cup straight like this. And that again is your brain telling you that it's on a flat surface and getting this wrong. So do take a look at that other video for more information. So if you're not working from a photograph, you've got a real life subject like this one here, you'll find that they're very sort of unpredictable. They move around. In fact, anything that's real will move. And even if it's something like a still life, the shadows will move. So when you're drawing something that's real, you want to think about what's going to move first. It could be the shadows. If you're drawing flowers, then very certainly the petals will be the first thing to fall. So this tip is all about fixing things. So you don't have this problem with photographs, but when you're working from real life, you want to fix things first of all. One thing you can do that's especially good with a still life or a landscape is you can take a photograph. Now it can be much better to work from real life. You can certainly see a lot more detail in things like a vase of flowers, but be aware that those flowers will move, the petals will drop, they'll turn to face the light, and the shadows in the room will change. So one thing that I like to do when working from real life is just to take a photograph. If you're sitting outdoors painting or drawing for 2 hours, everything can move. You know, the weather can completely change, especially if you're here in the UK. It can go from a day that's really hot and you're getting sunburnt to something that's snowing. It's always a big source of amusement to people that visit the UK, how much we talk about the weather. It's because it's a safe subject. It's not going to upset anyone, and it changes so often that there's always something to talk about. So this tip is all about if you're doing anything that's real life, even if you think it's an inanimate object, fix the outline first, take a quick snapshot of it on your phone. This is going to help you get consistency throughout your drawing. What you don't want is to have your shadows, you know, in one place when you started drawing, then they're in another place and nothing is cohesive and lands together. It's very, very difficult. I'm always being asked how to sort of guess where shadows go. It's not something that can be easily guessed. And so that's something that you need to fix in place first. So let's look at eye lines and horizon and finding the two, and also how modern methods of photography have sort of made this a little bit harder. Now, it's often said to beginners that the eye line and the horizon are level. Well, that's not always true. That's only true if somebody is standing on the ground and looking straight ahead. And then your vanishing point, your horizon, will be level with the eye line. But what if you lay down on the floor and look up at the sky? What if you're in an aeroplane or a hang glider looking down? The eye line is not always level with the horizon. And this has actually been made much more difficult by photographs and modern methods of photography. So in the past, we all held a camera level with our eyes like this. And so the eye line of the photographer was exactly where they stood. But now there are things like GoPros. We all hold our cameras up in the air and sort of try and get a better view, you know, lean them over walls and things like that. So we're not now looking at the photographer's eye line. We're now looking at almost the eye line of the camera lens. There is a simple way to figure out roughly where the photograph was taken from, the eye line if you like, but as I said, now it's more often the line of the camera rather than the person themselves. Let me show you how to find the eye line in a photograph. So the easiest way to figure out your eye line on a photograph is to see objects that you can see the top of. Now we have to be careful with this, so let me show you this first example. So this is a photograph I took years ago in Malta, and here are some flat areas. So I can see on top of this step here and these steps here. So I can say that I'm looking down at these, so my eye line has to be above these. Now, what about the wall? I can almost see just the tiniest slither of the top of the wall, but I can't see above anything here. Now, roofs don't count because they tend to tip up. So let's think here that my eye line is about level with the wall. Let's look at this picture here. There's not much to go on, but again, I'm looking for flat surfaces that are parallel to the floor. So horizontal flat surfaces. Again, I can slightly see on top of this windowsill here, but not by much. I can see a tiny bit of the top of these steps. So again, my eye line is about here. And you can see once we get up here, I can see underneath things. Now, it's quite common for the eye line to be fairly low if the person taking the photograph was standing on the ground. Let's look at this photograph here. Now, when I say flat surfaces, be careful of sloped roofs. So just because I can see the top of these roofs here, or even the top of these little huts here, doesn't mean that I'm above them because they are tipping up. They're not flat roofs. they're sloped roofs. So although I feel like I can see on top of this, I can't really because it's tipping up. So let's look for some areas I can see on top of. I can see on top of these flat pathway areas here, and I can see just a tiny bit on top of this fence here. Although there's a little fence post here that I can see on top of, it's obviously tilted over and tipping towards me. So that's something to be careful of if you live in a historic area where buildings might be a little bit wonky and roofs aren't necessarily particularly in line. My eye line in this picture is about here. Another way I can tell I'm looking up at these is because this front corner here points upwards, not down. And the same with this hut here. If we were to ignore the roof and take the roof off, this corner here points up, not down. That means I'm looking up at it. This corner here very slightly points down. That means I'm looking down at it. If you have a look at my drawing houses video, you'll find more information about this method. Let's look at something now that I've observed over many decades of teaching art, and that is that you will bring things in a photograph too close to you, and to some extent in real life as well. You'll bring things forwards, particularly things like buildings in landscapes, people, objects, focal points, even still life, you will tend to bring them forwards. Now, this isn't 100% rule, particularly things like still life, people can draw them too small, but certainly large things in landscapes, people nearly always bring them too far forward and make them too big. And what we have going on here is the fact that you're fighting your brain. Your brain is telling you that this lighthouse is absolutely massive, but the photograph that you've got to work from actually has the lighthouse very small. So this is something where your brain is going to fight your hands. So let me show you how to figure out how big to make something, because if you bring things too close in, what you're going to find then is that a lot of the peripheral stuff around the edge, you just can't fit in the picture. Now, if you're doing that as a conscious decision, that's okay, but you don't want to have to leave things out when you didn't intend to. So let's go back to this picture here. Now, the most interesting thing, the focal point in this picture, is this area here, this little round building. Not only is it a beautiful colour and it's lit up quite lovely, it's near to the centre and it's probably the most interesting thing in the picture. The trees are nice too, but it's the area that we are drawn to. Now, what this means is that your brain will automatically want to do this too big. So a simple way of stopping this from happening is to check the outside edges of your picture and to measure. I don't mean with a ruler, just some kind of straight line. And you want to be looking, for example, we can take a point from the top of the picture here and take it across to the side. And we can ask ourselves, is this halfway up the picture? I would say it's a little less than a third down from the top. I can also take a line down the center of the building and see how far across it comes. I can look at the width of this building and I can ask myself how many times that width would go into either side of it. And I can make some marks on my paper. I can say, well, it comes up to here. It's as wide as this. And then we start drawing in that area that we have ascertained to be the part of our paper that's going to take this building. In that way, we stop it just becoming any old size, and I guarantee it will become too large. Very, very rarely do I see people draw objects like this too small. If we draw it too large and bring it forward too much, we're going to find that there's no room at all to put these nice trees in either side. So I'm going to talk now about a few mindset issues, and these are just as important as practical skills. And the first one is that it's much easier to buy art materials than it is to create art. And you're all instantly feeling guilty. We all do it, don't we? It's much easier to buy a beautiful new set of pens than it is to do some drawing. And in some respects, this is because of modern life. We are just bombarded with all of these adverts all the time. But there's this kind of dopamine rush that we get when we buy something. And it's so much easier to think about the potential of an art material than to actually use it. Now, at this point, some of you might think to yourself, well, you're a bit hypocritical, Michele, because you've got these branded art materials, you've got art courses that you sell. And it's true, I do have all of those things, and I hope that they may help some of you, but I only want you to buy them if these are things that you need. I'd love you to buy an art course from me, but if you've already bought 10 art courses, you haven't taken any of them, then really you shouldn't be buying another one. The same with art materials. Rather than sort of what I call shopping backwards, in other words, just randomly sort of looking at things that you might like to create art with and buying them, what you should do is start by creating art and then bring in the things that you need. I always look at this in terms of cleaning my house, actually. I'm somebody that likes to be quite neat and quite tidy and clean. I don't really use a lot of cleaning products. I mostly just use things like dishwashing soap and white vinegar. But my friends who struggle with this, who have the dirtiest and the muckiest houses, who often ask me to go and help them to clear up or to declutter, I am astonished by how many cleaning products they have in their houses, far more than they could ever use, and most of them are unused. And the reason for this is that if you feel overwhelmed by the idea of cleaning or tidying your house, buying another bottle of bleach almost feels like you're taking action. So I just want this to be something that you watch out for in your own practice. Buy the things that you need. Don't replace making art with buying stuff. The next one is that negative self-talk is a self-fulfilling prophecy. It absolutely is. I don't know why artists struggle with figuring this out, because sportsmen have certainly figured it out. You never hear them saying they're going to fail before they go into an arena or a ring. And business people have this figured out too, that it's really important to think positively about your practice and to talk positively, not only to other people, but also with that internal voice. So how do we do this practically? Now, what I'm talking about is not saying all the time, I can't draw. I've never been any good at drawing. I'm rubbish at drawing. I always fail at drawing. Now, it might be a big jump. You might understand that you need to think more positively, but it's actually quite a big jump to say, I'm great at drawing, when maybe you actually aren't great at drawing. So what I like to do is look at this as a work in progress. It's often thought about that drawing is something you can do or something you can't do. But really, everything we learn is a process. You shouldn't say to yourself on the first driving lesson, I can't drive, I can never drive. In fact, this is something I used to say to myself. And then eventually I did learn to drive. So what you want to do is to talk about yourself as a progress, as a work in progress. So what I'm talking about, saying things like, I am learning to draw. I'm making progress every day. I'm really working hard at improving my drawing. And one day I'm going to be really good at drawing. And Gimlet, of course, is interrupting me today. Gimlet is never going to be good at drawing because Gimlet doesn't do any drawing practice. And what about comparing yourself to other people? This is so easy, isn't it? The internet is full of narcissistic people showing off with all of their pretty pictures. It can be very easy to compare yourself to other people's progress and feel like you're really not doing well enough, or even if you're going to an art class and you see the person next to you just seems to draw effortlessly. All I can say about this is it's just a complete waste, literally a waste of your time that could be spent learning to draw a little better, comparing yourself with other people. We're getting more and more images show up from artificial intelligence, and even when images are real, you have absolutely no idea of that person's circumstances, how many years they've been practicing for, how much money they have for materials, how much tuition they can afford. You just don't have any idea, and you're just really sabotaging your own progress. So I was talking in a recent video about how I would like to learn to speak Italian. I am absolutely awful at languages. I know I shouldn't have this negative self-talk, but I know from my experience that it's not something I pick up quickly. I still believe I can do it, but if I saw somebody that became fluent in Italian in 6 months and it took me 6 years, it might be a little bit depressing, and I would be thinking about that other person. Why can they do it more quickly than me? Then really all I need to think about is I would like to learn Italian, and so I'm going to work on learning to speak Italian. It doesn't really matter what other people are doing because it's of no use to me. It's a bit like worry. We all have worries and we all have anxiety. But the future is not something that we can control, and how long it takes you to learn to draw and how quickly you make progress is not something that you can necessarily control. Of course, the more you practice, the better you're going to do. And the more you seek out tutorials like this, the better you're going to do. But comparing yourself to someone who seems to be doing better than you is just a side road that you don't want to travel along. It's just an absolutely pointless waste of time. And I suggest that you don't do it. So I would love to know in the comments which of the things I've spoken about today has resonated with you particularly and how it's going to help you going forwards. before you leave this video, don't forget to have a look in the video description. Not only will I list down there any other helpful drawing videos that I can direct you to that are all free to watch, there's also some free downloadable PDFs. There's even a free painting course that you can take. And if you enjoyed this video, I think you're going to enjoy my most popular video ever, which is actually some really fast drawing tips that are going to improve your drawing really quickly.